Okay, so we'll kick off. Hopefully maybe a few more will join us along the way. Can you hear me and see the screen okay and everything? Okay, if there are any questions or anything, I will leave those to the end. I'll check, just stick them in the chat box and I'll run through them after the presentation. So this academic skills workshop is going to look at note-taking. We are going to be running academic skills workshops every Wednesday at 1 for the rest of the trimester, and again after Christmas as well. And there is also online version. So we have a self-enroll module on Brightspace. It's called All Student Supports, and that has a kind of e-learning version of these academic skills workshops as well as some other really useful resources in there. So like I say, today we're going to be looking at note-taking. So we're going to look at the skill of note-taking for university level. And I'm going to ask you to reflect on how you've been taking notes so far. So we'll talk about when to take notes, why we take notes in class, and look at organization for preparing for note-taking, and talk about how it's an important part of the learning process. So it's not just a kind of a record of what's been said, it's actually part of what helps you to learn as well. So we'll also take a look at some specific note-taking methods and make sure that you're taking the right notes to make them as useful and effective as possible. And then we'll finish up just with a summary of tips as well. So if we look at how you've been taking notes so far, have you been trying to write down everything the lecturer says, if that's the case, or no matter how you take them, are they useful to you afterwards? So it's kind of remembering that note-taking isn't just an activity for class, but something that should be a really useful study aid as well. And then maybe have a think about, has your note-taking changed from when you first started? I know we're not that far into the year, but has there been a change maybe from how you did it previously, previous education, up until now? So firstly, think about, what are you writing in class? Are you using full sentences? Do you just jot down keywords and phrases? Are you writing down material that's maybe already on the slides, or are you using the notes to maybe create mind maps? So there's lots of different techniques that are out there. So we're going to look at what can be most effective, depending as well on the way that you learn. And then it's not just what we do in class, but also what do you do with those notes after class? So do you read them back soon after the class to check for clarity and understanding when the information is still fresh? Do you rewrite the notes after class and maybe restructure them and elaborate on what was discussed? Or do you maybe type them up, and then you can obviously easily edit them and organize them? Or do you maybe not look at them at all until you're preparing for assessment, which obviously is the way a lot of us do go, but not the ideal way. So in this workshop, we're going to talk about the process in class, but also what we would recommend you would do with the notes afterwards as well. So on that, like, most of us do associate note-taking with being in class, but it's also really important to think about the other contexts where note-taking can be useful. So when you're doing readings, the recommended readings, rather than just underlining or highlighting, it's actually much more effective if you're actively reading and taking notes of the most important information and then rephrasing it in your own words so that you understand it better. Now, I know obviously at the moment a lot of readings are going to be digital, but again, not to just copy and paste, which is so easily done, but to really break that down, do it in your own words. When you're doing research, write down notes, but also keep a note of what you're searching for and where you've searched. So you've got less duplication of effort when you come back to it later and you don't end up doing the same thing. You can also use it when you're planning an essay or an assignment. So take note of, what are your ideas, what's your plan for the essay, and where's your research going to fit into it. So notes are also useful then when you're working on a problem, to keep track of what approaches you've tried already and which solutions you've tested. So there's lots of different contexts where it can be useful. So why do we take notes? So there's a number of reasons. It is obviously the idea of having a written record later as a study aid, but it's a lot more than that as well. So it encourages you to actively listen. It's really about that. It's thinking about the content when you're in the class, and that kind of forces you to actively pay attention. So sometimes, like, I would have students who use a live scribe and they find that they don't even have to actually look back over the notes that they've taken necessarily. The very act of having written the notes as they're listening is enough to help them retain the information. So in terms of organization then, in getting ready to take notes. So first of all, think about where you're sitting in class. So obviously in these huge lecture halls, especially, where you sit can have a real impact on the quality of your whole experience and therefore on the notes that you're taking. And the answer, of course, to this is sitting down the front. This bit that's highlighted in green is the best place to sit. Even though we may sometimes want to just sit in at the back, especially now, like I say, in a lecture hall that's this big. If you're sitting anywhere but the front, you've got the distraction of all of these heads in front of you. And now, obviously, a lot of people on laptops, and hopefully they're doing something that's related to class, but they very well might not be. And it's very hard not to get that in your line of sight and get distracted. If you're at the front, because you're closer to the speaker, it feels more like they're speaking to you directly, which encourages you to pay attention. You can hear better, you can see better. And also think about things like the lighting. And, make sure that you're not like in a draft from a doorway or a glare from a window, because, it's natural that after 10, 15 minutes, our minds start to wander. It's hard to maintain focus. And if you have something like that that's distracting you, it's very easy for that then to take your attention away. So all of those factors will really impact on the quality of the notes you take. And then just the basics as well, like figure out what works best for you and make sure you have those materials with you. So little things like generally it's better to use a pen than a pencil because it's easier to read back with, or read back rather. Lined paper helps to keep things neat. We would recommend that you put the name and the date, the name of the class and the date on the top of each page. Using a notebook with dividers can be useful for different topics or different modules, or using a refill pad where you can take out the pages and reorganize them later. So it's all about really making sure you have a system that works for you and that you have everything in place for that. It's really important to be taking notes because most students in UCD are taking 6 modules each semester. For each of those modules, you're going to have lectures, but you'll also have tutorials, you might have labs and other types of classes as well. So you want to be able to collate all the information that's relevant to each module together. So make sure that you have the equipment that you need. It might be as simple as a pen, it might require other items as well. So just make sure you know what you need and you have it with you. And there's a number of apps that'll help you to keep everything in place. So OneNote and Evernote are 2 really useful tools. So OneNote will be available to you through Office 365, which you have access to as a UCD student. You can download it from UCD Connect. And Evernote is a very similar tool, but it's a free tool. There is a premium version, but you pretty much get everything you need in the free version. And they're kind of like a scrapbook. So the great thing about them is you can upload PDFs to it, so you can put all your readings in there. You can write text notes, you can annotate on the PDFs, but you can also add video files, audio notes. So they're really useful. I always say Evernote, I would recommend to students who are, if you're the kind of person who might have notes all over the room, and to anyone else it looks like a mess, but you know where stuff is, that's where they're really good, because there's much more space than a traditional refill pad or just a Word file or whatever. So they're both really worth looking into. And we do a class on apps for learning as well, where we go into these in a lot of detail. So note-taking can be challenging to master, but it really is worth the time to get it right, and getting it right at an early stage, because it really helps with the learning process, as we mentioned. So it's important to try out different methods of note-taking until you find the one that suits you. So you'll probably adapt styles or merge different styles together until you find one that works. But the more personal it is, the more memorable the material will be. So you have to write it down in a way that makes sense for you. So the example here is kind of, are you more likely to remember the details of a journey that you took yourself, or one that somebody tells you about? As in, using someone else's notes, it can be helpful, but it's really not a substitute for your own, because it's the very process of taking the notes that helps you to process that information and assimilate it with the knowledge that you already have. So it is actually part of the learning process. So you're taking the original information, you're not just making a record of that, you're actually thinking through that information, you're reshaping it into your own style, and that's what creates the learning. So, traditionally we might think about just memorizing the original information, which is rote learning. And that's obviously a lot of the time in school, there's a big focus on that. Now, you may still have to do that, very much depends on your subject matter. Things like formulas and things like that do need to be rote learned. But that in and of itself isn't true learning. It's only when you apply it, process it and apply it and try it, that learning has really taken place. And that's what's really needed at university level. So you can't just kind of regurgitate, learn material in exams. You really have to kind of go another step further. So the content in your lecture, really, it's a good way to think of it as that's the starting point. And when you walk away with your notes from that, that's when you can start to put it together with other reading and research, apply it to your assessments and so on. So then the methods, different methods of note taking. Consider it carefully and think about which suits your learning style best. So there's a few different ones. So first of all, in terms of just how the format that you take them in, do you handwrite or do you type? So there can be different pros and cons for each of those. So handwriting actually can increase critical thinking. It helps you to understand and retain the content, and it can take longer, but because you're kind of having to summarize what's being said, that's where the learning can really take place. And obviously then it's more efficient when you're trying to review the material later. If you're doing it in that way, you'll kind of spot the parts that maybe you don't understand that you need further clarification on. And it actually promotes long-term memory recall. So even the fact that you're writing on paper and you can remember what it looks like, all those visual cues really help, especially if you're a visual learner, using different colored pens to break down subjects and topics. And you can actually recall it then from having seen it written down rather than just hearing the lecturer say it. So all of that can really serve to promote productivity when you come to try and remember the information. So handwriting and typing, they actually use like different cognitive skill sets, and research has shown that handwriting is actually more effective when it comes to remembering things long term. So there is science there behind that. One of the cons, obviously, is the flip side that it does take twice as long. But it still can be, if you do it right and you don't try and write everything down verbatim, it can still be a very quick and functional way to get the information down. And the other kind of con is that you can miss what's being said. So if you do try and write down everything that's said, you're going to maybe fall behind and miss parts, and then that can lead to having a hole in your notes, which is difficult then to piece everything together. So typing notes is more efficient. So on average, it takes approximately 20 minutes to type 1,000 words, whereas it takes 45 minutes to handwrite the same amount. So when you break it down like that, typing is more efficient in that sense. It can make the whole study session run smoother. And it's easy to go back and edit your notes, then restructure things. And then you've got spell check and autocorrect and all those things, which make it easier. So it's really about which one suits you. But the con of that then, because it is so much quicker, is that it can lead to kind of mindless note taking. If you're a quick typer, you can start to just incorporate details that maybe aren't going to have a huge amount of value when you go to review your notes. So just think about that, because you don't want to end up having gone to all that effort and then maybe it not having a huge amount of value. So the linear method of note taking, that's the one that the majority of us would do. It's just straightforward, using bullet points to write down the key themes and the main ideas, and then use section titles and headings where possible, put a bit of shape on it, and then it can work well then when you're reshaping it into your own words and rewording it. But always make sure to include kind of core definitions and keywords. They're the things that you definitely want to get down. Flow notes then are a little bit more like what I was saying with Evernote and OneNote. So they allow for a bit more of a range, color, the inclusion of pictures or doodles, using arrows and so on. So it can be more engaging, especially for a visual learner. And in that case, you would probably use more like a, unlined paper like Sketchpad or something along those lines. But just make sure then the pitfall with these is that it can lead to procrastination. So you can get so immersed maybe in a doodle or something that you're losing where the class is going. And then there's a method of writing on the slides. So if you get the slides, especially before the lecture, you can produce them, you can export the slides like that from a PDF or a PowerPoint, where you have this little kind of notes section beside the slide. And the advantage of doing that is you've got everything together. You've got your slides alongside your own notes, and it means that you probably won't end up copying just anything that's on the slide because it'll be right there beside you. But it can sometimes discourage people from rewording it. So still make sure that you're putting your own spin on it and processing that information. The Cornell method then, this is one that's really popular for students in college. So this is its kind of most basic form. There's just 2 columns. The left column is for the topics or the questions, and then the right column is where you write the kind of extensive detail, longer descriptions. So you have the theme or the setting, say, on the left, and then the description on the right. So obviously it's easier to impose this side of it after class. So if you kind of divide it like this and you take down your detail here, and then after class you read over that and you put the themes down, again, that's all part of processing all of that information rather than just having this kind of data from class that you haven't critically kind of looked at. In its kind of advanced form, you divide the paper into 3 sections. So you have your Q column on the left, your note-taking column on the right, and then beneath it you have a summary. So the idea is that in class you write this note-taking section and you give it as much detail as possible. And then either during or straight after class, you go back over and you identify, just pull out the keywords or the key questions. And then when you're revising your notes, you do this summary section. So it could be straight after class or maybe at the end of the week that you kind of put in a summary of what the entire lecture was about. And then there's kind of a 5-step process for that and for how it can be used effectively. So you record to begin with, then you write in your questions afterwards, and then you can actually cover the right-hand side that has all the detail and description in it, and uncover the left and use the questions or the keywords to prompt you to remember what it was that you'd taken down. And then once you've done that, you can start to kind of ask reflective questions about that. So the examples there, what's the significance of these facts? What principle are they based on? And how can I apply them? And then at a later point, then you can spend some time reviewing. So we'd recommend at the end of each week that you do this with all of your notes from class. Now, I know that can seem like an impossible task sometimes when you have deadlines and assessments, but the idea being, of course, that if you do this on a regular basis, it'll feed into all of that, and that they'll be much easier then to take on. And then the last method here is mind mapping. So this is obviously a very visual way to present information, so it's good for visual learners, but it's particularly good as well for any really complicated concepts or ideas. So you put your kind of central topic in the middle, you branch off from that with the subtopics, and then you continue to branch out from there. And the idea with these is you can use images, you can use colors, it's more of a kind of an organic way of looking at things. Now, it can be difficult to actually do this within class because you kind of need to know the overall structure before you can put this shape on it. But it's a really good tool maybe to take the notes that you already have and then create a mind map from them. And as well as being used as kind of a note-taking method, you can use it for the basis when you're starting an essay or something like that as well. So this is a mind map kind of template that could be used in terms of you write what's the thesis statement, what's my introduction going to be, and then you break down the 3 arguments and the topics you're going to cover under each of those. Now we do another workshop on academic writing that will cover this in more detail, and we actually have one that's just specifically on mind maps as well. There's tools online that you can try for creating mind maps. So Coggle is a free one, really useful tool. You can insert images, videos, files. So it's a great way of actually, especially when you're researching, again, a bit like Evernote and OneNote, that you can bring all that information together. But the mind map allows you to kind of put a shape on all that rather than just having a kind of a repository of lots of different resources. And again, we go into that in some more detail in the mind mapping workshop, which you can access through the Brightspace module that I mentioned earlier as well. In terms of recording classes then, so some students with disabilities would have permission to record classes as a reasonable accommodation. If you don't have that as a support and you would like to record your classes, you will need to get permission from each individual lecturer. But there might be one class in particular that you want to record, but do just make sure you cannot record without the permission. If you have that permission and you're using a recording device, so something like a live scribe pen, it's important that you still have a note-taking strategy. So just because you're getting the audio and you'll have the whole thing, you know, it's just like writing down everything verbatim. It's not going to be useful to have just a whole 50-minute recording. So the idea with a tool like that is that you kind of signpost nearly the most important points in the audio. And again, that performs the function of getting you to focus on what's being said. So it's kind of a way of like bookmarking the recording. Because obviously if you had all of that to listen back to, it's just like having to attend all the classes again. So it's all about being able to filter it down and find what's the most useful information. And then from that, you could go back and do something like the Cornell method or a mind map and so on. But just remember as well, if you did have that permission, it's not appropriate for like group discussions and tutorial classes and that kind of thing. Audio notes then, to actually make your own audio notes after class as opposed to writing them, that can be really useful if you're an auditory learner and you learn best by listening, or for someone who has long commutes. It's another way because it's all about reinforcement and reviewing that information. So, you know, you could record it. You could be using, say, a speech to text tool, which is available in Google Drive and in Office 365. You've got dictation tools. You could be recording those as audio notes and effectively writing them up as written notes as well. So you've got it in both formats if you wanted to. So the important thing is making sure that those audio notes have a similar structure to the written notes. Again, you don't want to just listen back to huge chunks or just be reading entire readings. It's about filtering it down to what's useful. And then you can choose, you could have it read back to you in you could make an actual recording with your own voice, or you could have it that it's typed up and you listen back to it through a text-to-speech function, which again is available built in through Word and things like that. So just make sure it's something that you can listen to over a long period of time. A lot of people are put off text-to-speech because we kind of associate it with this robotic voices that don't have much intonation, but they actually have really progressed with that now with some very natural sounding voices. So it's another good way to learn. And there's a couple of free note-taking apps if you do get the permission, but you don't have the accommodation. If you have the accommodation, we would generally in all would provide students with a tool like a LiveScribe, or there's some online tools as well that do a really good job. But in terms of the free ones, we've got Koji and Otter AI. So Koji is one that it's listening. Once you turn it on, it'll be listening for everything, but it doesn't actually record until you click record, and then it'll jump back 15 seconds. I think you can actually set it up to 45 seconds before you press record. So, because obviously it's only when they've said it that you realize, oh, this is something I want to catch. It'll rewind effectively and catch all of that and have it recorded. And the other one is Otter AI, which provides a transcript. So again, full transcript, you know, maybe not useful to have the entire thing, but if it takes your focus off trying to write everything down and puts your focus on really listening, that can be really useful as well. This slide is taken from the online version of the Academic Skills Workshop. So if you'd like to have a look in there, there'll be links to any of the things that we've mentioned, and you can download it then from the App Store. So in terms of taking the right notes, so what do we mean by that? So I've mentioned it before, it's all about active listening in class so that the notes make sense and are useful. So there's lots of ways you can kind of prepare yourself to stay focused. So this kind of goes back to what do we do before the class, before any note-taking takes place. So first of all, you could, if you have the lecture material in advance, it's a good idea to read it beforehand, because the slides will obviously really indicate what are the key points. And many lecturers do provide the slides and the notes before classes. If your lecturer doesn't make that material available, the alternative is to look at the course schedule and find out what topic you're going to be covering, or do any recommended as well before class. And another key idea is to review the notes from the previous class for that module and you go into this class. So that'll all get you in the current frame, the right frame of mind for the current class. So especially when you're hopping from one module to another, that can be really useful. So yeah, as we've said, taking notes is a learning aid. If you don't understand anything though, do make sure to follow up, whether that's asking a question in class, following up with an email or a question in the discussion forum if that's being used on your course. Just don't leave yourself wondering, because obviously the further time goes on, the harder it'll be to figure out that information. Yeah, as we mentioned earlier, it's important to try or not to try to write down absolutely everything. It's not necessary, so don't worry if you don't catch it all. Make sure you're not just writing what's already on the slides, and listen for important information and trigger words. That can be really helpful. So it can be really hard to know from the outset, you know, what exactly are the most important points. So these are kind of trigger words. If you hear the lecturer mention any of these, obviously if it's anything assessment related and it may not be mentioned elsewhere, try and get that down. Same with assignments, essays, exams. But if they kind of mention, you know, to sum up, the main points are in conclusion, any of those things at the end of the class, they will tend to do a little wrap up. So keep an ear out for that, for any of these phrases. So in conclusion then, kind of summary of tips is, don't try to write down every word, number the pages, file your notes as soon as possible. So the sooner you can get back to them, like we suggested, that kind of thing at the weekend of reviewing all of the notes for the week. Or as well, just after class, if you even do 10 minutes extra on them after class, it's going to have such payoff in the end. And then reprocess that information. So whether that's cue cards, audio notes, mind maps, testing yourself with that Cornell method, they're all really good ways of doing it. And then, yeah, less is more. So don't worry about getting everything down. Start to really kind of critically listen and listen out for those important key points and getting those down. So I'm just going to stop sharing now and see if there's been any questions in the... Does anyone have any questions that you want to stick in the chat box? While I'm waiting, I will just let you know that I think next week's class is on time management. So that's delivered by one of our occupational therapists. So she has loads of great methods, and it certainly kind of coming to that time of year when that can be really, really useful, because I know people are starting to get really swamped with deadlines. It feels like we've only just started the year, and already I know that people are under a lot of pressure. And for anyone who's returning, it's obviously, well, for all of us, it's kind of strange times, the transition back to campus. So that one will be really useful. But like I say, in the meantime, if you want to refer back to this, or if you miss any of the workshops, there is an online version that you can work through yourself. They have a lot of interactivity built in. And likewise, I mean, it's hard for us sometimes to structure these at the absolute best time, in the sense that, you know, there's one on presentation. So it depends on your own courses and your own disciplines when they might be coming to the fore for you. So if there's any in the next semester that you feel like you'd really love to have a look at now, they'll all be available to you online as well. So there's recordings of last year's workshops, but there's also, like I say, these purpose-built online learning versions that are probably the best way to view if you're working on your own at home. So I don't think we have any questions there. So we're bang on the 1:30 mark. So time now, hopefully you all have time to grab a bite of lunch before moving on to your next class. If you do have any questions at all, you can email disability@ucd.ie and we will certainly get back to you on that. But otherwise, I think I will leave it for now. No worries. Thank you. Thanks for coming, guys. Stop recording.